Why is global and multi-jurisdictional education so important right now?
First of all, they must have a DPO or someone taking care of their global privacy program. Even if they are a small biopharma company, this is needed. And this is because clinical trials evolve fast. And at the beginning, you start with one country and your compliance program is very controlled. But very rapidly, you move into a multi country clinical trial. And there is where the challenges start. Because even in the European Union, there are very different positions. The most important message I want to share today, it's not a one-time job, it's not a one, it's evolving. And necessarily teams will grow in a pharma company, so you need to bring everybody on board and make sure they understand the message, so it cannot be too complex. Privacy is not here to prohibit processing activity.
So now with AI in the picture, especially AI tools and their involvement in clinical research, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that organizations are facing? And what have you seen in your personal experience?
First of all, that pseudonymized data is anonymized data. So we can use AI key coded data, and that's not personal data. That is the biggest gap and risk. So the second is that in terms of, let's say, if you use AI for compliance work, is that AI can do your job. It cannot, because it's very hard for AI. They help, AI helps a lot and its use will increase. And we all need to get familiar with AI. But you need to have someone, human oversight, someone dictating the rules and guiding AI on the things AI needs to do.
Welcome to Pharmatica, the podcast that explores the pharmaceutical life cycle through real world insights and practical strategies. I'm your host, Shubhangi Dua, podcast producer and B2B journalist. Today, I'm joined by Diana Andrade, founder and managing director at RD Privacy and data protection officer for Biopharma and Life Sciences organizations. So, this episode, we will be talking about a clinical and fast evolving subject in clinical research, data protection, in an era of AI, of course, and how organizations can innovate responsibly while staying compliant across borders. Welcome, Diana. It's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about what I do in the clinical trial scope and how clinical trial sponsors and pharmaceutical companies can still innovate and be compliant with applicable laws.
Oh, that's great to hear. So before we dive into the actual nuances of pharmaceutical life sciences, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in pharma.
After graduating from law, I moved to Madrid and to do my international data master, so an LLM in international law. And then I started working as a trainee at a law firm, Jones Day. During 2 years, I was there, and I touched data protection and intellectual property. After my trainee period, I started working at PPD, a CRO, and I started working first with side contracts. So I was doing the contracts for the clinical trials with the hospitals. After a few years working in that department, where I had to address some briefly privacy rules, privacy clauses in the contracts, I realized it was really an area that I would like to explore more. So I joined the privacy department. And my journey on privacy started right there. So during several years, almost 10 years, I was working at PPD. Then I moved into another mid-sized CRO. Once I was there, I discovered that many sponsors worldwide needed specific data protection support. And there was a gap because many lawyers that were aware of data protection regulations didn't have the experience in clinical research. And that made me realize that it was time for me to step up, to open my company, and start supporting these pharma companies on how to really implement data protection laws and rules to the reality of clinical research.
So, what's the one key thing you would like to tell the audience so they stay tuned in?
It's very hard to say one thing because, as you mentioned, we are in an era of AI. And AI changes the game for data protection. Before you used AI, data protection was, ruling, it was evolving, and you had to implement really important controls on how to protect personal data. And with GDPR in 2018, this was an important change. But now that we are seeing AI being introduced in clinical research, this is another phase for compliance because the risks are increased, because we need to implement, internal controls and procedures that expand from what GDPR is or data protection is in itself. But if I would like to, if you want to tell me, to ask me one challenge in the pharmaceutical sector, specifically in clinical research, from a data protection perspective, I would say global clinical trials. And let me explain to you. Clinical trials are global and they apply many regulations where the it's not only GDPR, it is the laws of the countries where the clinical trial is conducted. Within the European Union, GDPR rules, and you have local laws that adapt and create additional rules, but it's more or less harmonized. Let's say not don't use that word harmonized because you have many differences within the European Union. But anyways, it's GDPR. But if usually clinical trials are conducted in many other countries and in many other regions, so there is a big challenge of being aware of these laws and of drafting and creating a global privacy program for these global clinical trials. And that is for me, is for what I do. And it's for me where is the biggest challenge of doing privacy right in clinical research.
So, now with AI in the picture, especially AI tools and their involvement in clinical research, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that organizations are facing? And what have you seen in your personal experience?
First of all, that pseudonymized data is anonymized data. So we can use AI key coded data, and that's not personal data. That is the biggest gap and risk. So the second is that in terms of, let's say, if you use AI for compliance work, is that AI can do your job. It cannot. Because it's very hard for AI. They help, AI helps a lot and its use will increase. And we all need to get familiar with AI. But you need to have someone, human oversight, someone dictating the rules and guiding AI on the things AI needs to do. So it's on one hand, really understanding what are the uses of AI. So how are you going to use AI and create processes internally within the organization that allows the uses of AI in a controlled way and compliant way. And on another level is ensuring that you oversee the uses and you really do not delegate everything to AI, and having always in mind that AI can make mistakes. So really, checking the responses, making sure that not trusting 100% on what AI delivers.
Definitely. I have to agree with you there. But there's one more thing I was wondering about. If you had to paint me a picture of, let's say, a researcher in part of clinical trial, they're using AI, what is the good way that they should be using AI, and what's one way that they should not be using AI at all?
Well, there are many ways of using AI, and there are possibilities to use AI to write clinical research protocols, for example, something that takes you a very long time. And with AI, you can be more creative. You can really put there what you want and the concerns that you have, and the tool will help you doing that. It allows you to create documents, procedures, internal procedures to really support the growing of the organization. Because if you think about clinical trials, you have different entities running clinical trials. You have small pharma that has, doesn't have a very big team, and relies in external consultants and contractors to develop their activities. Then you have big pharma with big teams. Even big pharma, they use AI, and the more they use AI, the less big teams they will have. It will come with time, but I don't want to create any raise any concerns in this aspect. I'm just saying that the uses of AI vary depending on the size of the teams an organization has. There are multiple uses, even uses to analyze data and try to find different uses for that data to develop a new drug. So there are, from developing a document to finding out a new drug, there's a variety of possibilities for using AI. But what you have to think is you will provide confidential data, business confidential data, on one hand, and on another hand, you will provide personal data, even if it's key coded data. So you need a very a good compliance program that exceeds GDPR compliance and enters into what is AI regulation.
Yes, that's exactly what I was looking for because I think using good data, but not only that, making sure that it's fully protected because pharma is such a sensitive data. It's like directly dealing with patients. So one of the most sensitive areas you can be in. So I think you're so right in saying that that's the key. From your experience with advising sponsors across the world, where do organizations usually fall short with cross-border data transfers and regulatory compliance?
So many organizations are not aware that they are actually transferring data outside the European Union. They don't understand how it works. And also, they believe that the principal issue is understanding they are transferring personal data. So let's say if they are saying we are using this vendor, and this vendor will only collect doctors' data, are we sharing personal data? But this is, public data.
Right.
This is a challenge. The GDPR does, even if the data is public, if you are using the data for your purposes, you need to have a lawful basis. You need to implement controls. And if you are transferring data outside the European Union, you need to have standard contractual clauses in place, unless this is an adequacy country, a country with granted with an adequacy decision. Now, and one thing I want to highlight here, this is not unique for the European Union. You have many countries across the world with requirements on data localization and cross border transfers. I'm thinking about China. I'm thinking about Turkey with requirements on notifying the Data Protection Authority for international transfers of data outside Turkey. I'm thinking about Bosnia, for example. So there are many jurisdictions, not only the GDPR, that impose controls on transfers.
There's one sensitive area that I was thinking about employees can sort of stumble upon is when they're struggling with work and they're dealing with sensitive data that has to be ensured as part of the compliance procedure. And I guess they don't realize that when they put that data to analyze something using an AI model, they might actually be breaking that clause. So, how important that actually training is for them to ensure that if they are using AI, it has to be the one sanctioned not just by the company, but for that particular project, all permissions are met.
And especially when you think about the teams, they have to first of all training, and that's why I created the Global Academy. So I recently launched my academy to train teams on how to implement data protection controls in their daily work. The trainings right now available are only on GDPR, but the academy will expand to other jurisdictions. And I did it because it's very, very important that teams understand how data protection law applies. And for example, you mentioned this about the transfers. You're using a vendor, a service provider, to assess and provide, some services using personal data. And this vendor is located in the US, for example. If you are an US company, you think, okay, but I'm in the US, this vendor is in the US, there is no transfer. But you need to think about the location of the individuals from which they, the subjects of the data. So if they are based in Europe, even though you are in the US, you are transferring data outside the European Union to another party. So you need to implement the right controls. So it may be complex to people that are not working with data protection on a daily basis, but as long as they have the right training, they will feel more empowered. They will recognize the triggers and they will escalate, because the secret for a good privacy program is to have the right escalation points, to have a training in place, and to ensure that you have an escalation point for teams that if they have any doubt, they can always reach out and the answers will be answered. So they feel empowered to do their job. I think data protection can cause some discomfort to people that are not aware of how it rules. But if they have the training, if they have the point of contact to escalate, they will feel more and more empowered and secure to operate. So that is also my goal.
It's so great to see that you're doing something that is so timely and needed, especially in the age of AI, honestly. And that brings me to my next question. Why is global and multi-jurisdictional education so important right now?
First of all, they must have a DPO or someone taking care of their global privacy program. Even if they are a small biopharma company, this is needed. And this is because clinical trials evolve fast. And at the beginning, you start with one country and your compliance program is very controlled. But very rapidly, you move into a multi country clinical trial. And there is where the challenges start. Because even in the European Union, as I mentioned, there are very different positions. So, for example, in one country, your lawful basis to process the data in clinical research is the consent of the individual. In other countries, is the legal obligation and legitimate interest of the sponsor. And this will trigger different obligations. So when you rely on legitimate interest, you need to do a legitimate interest assessment to ensure that your interests will not override the interests of and the rights of the individuals. So automatically, and this varies from country to country. So if you do not have this well known and this in your program documentation that will demonstrate that you have done the work, very fast your clinical trial can be a mess. I usually say data protection is like a puzzle. And when you apply to clinical trials, it's like you have a puzzle with multiple pieces, and you need to put every piece in order to create this full image. And this is the role of the DPO, or the responsible for the data protection at an organization, to make sure that you have the completed piece the moment you move into different phases of your processing activities. So once you have, just a clinical trial in one country, this is easy to do. But then the more it grows, the more pieces you add, and the puzzle will become bigger and bigger. So it's you need to have this role, this data protection officer or privacy officer, that supports your organization, that trains your teams, and that this is a journey. It's not, a work that you do and it's there and it's in an archive. It's a life tool, it's live work, it's a journey together with the clinical operations teams. So I think this is the message, the most important message I want to share today. It's not a one-time job. It's not a one. It's evolving, and necessarily teams will grow in a pharma company. So you need to bring everybody on board and make sure they understand the message. So it cannot be too complex so they don't understand what you're trying to achieve. But giving them, it's again empowering them with the necessary information they need to have to do their jobs, and going on this journey with them, listen to them, understanding their goals. There is no impossibles. Privacy is not here to prohibit processing activity, to prohibit innovation. Privacy is here to allow sustainable innovation, and with the intention of protecting individuals, which are the most important asset for a pharma company. Pharma company needs patients, so they need to protect them.
Yes, I completely agree with you. That's one of the, I think, most key takeaways from this conversation that I have noted is to protect your patients, to actually do well for their welfare and conduct, and in the future, continue to conduct these clinical trials for further welfare. You need to ensure that you're constantly on top of your data privacy policies and training your employees to do the same, especially now with AI in the picture, because advancements are at a race. They're going at such a fast pace, and companies, all they care about is competing with each other. But I'm sorry, take a step back, reevaluate your data policy, match it with innovation, and then take a step forward.
Yeah, agree. And the thing is, if you think about, they need the patients to do the clinical trials, they will collect the data on the patients. But if there is a breach, if that patient data is out there, they can be really impact. And patients, if they lose trust in pharma, they will start saying, no, I do not want to participate in a clinical trial. So it's really connected with patient recruitment and retention, to ensure a proper privacy program in place and ensure that the rights of the patients are really protected the more the trial evolves.
That's right. And there's one more thing before we finish the conversation. You mentioned earlier about the RD Privacy Watch platform that you're starting out. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, so recently launched this platform, and basically the reason why I launched it is because global data protection officers, they really need to keep up to date with the global data protection news and releases and guidances from the authorities. And we have so many data protection laws worldwide. It's really a difficult task to be updated of all the developments. So this platform basically centralized all the data protection news from data protection authorities worldwide, summarizes these news, and provides the link to the source. So, if someone wants to investigate further that news, it can click in the link of the source and can be taken to the website of the authority and read in detail what that news is. And in addition, this platform will summarize the most relevant news of the week. So people, if they don't have a lot of time to read all the feed, they will have this weekly digest to have a summary of the more relevant news. And then they can see, okay, there is a very relevant news or fine or whatever in the UK. So let me see, and they can filter in the feed for the UK authority to really have that news, and can go into the source, as I mentioned before, to have a proper detailed information about what's happening in the UK. I created it for me to be able to be up to date. And then I realized, this is super useful for a lot of privacy professionals. So let me put it, let me launch it and put it live and allow others to benefit from it.
That's a great initiative, Diana. And honestly, I'm really glad that we had this conversation today because it's so, so important for the world to kind of to stay updated and abreast of pharma news, not just the pharma industry, but patients as well, because this directly relates to them. Is there anything that we haven't talked about and you want to talk about before we end the conversation?
Well, I think we touched a lot of points. The global trials, the different regulations, how it's important to have teams trained. Maybe what I want to also highlight is that data protection in clinical trials is a very, very specific, is a niche. And I think it's very important to have, a data protection officer or someone advising pharma companies that really understand about clinical trials, because it's very easy to forget about some requirements, or if you don't have really the picture of what is a clinical trial, you may not address the necessary points. You may not understand the clinical operations team and their needs. And about that, I will give you an example. Recently, I was reviewing an ICF, and this is a very specific example, but I wanted to share this with you so you have an understanding of what I want to say. So I was reviewing an ICF, and the CRO said, in this country, a regulatory authority issued a guideline that we need to collect consent we need to justify the reason why we are collecting race and ethnicity, and we need to collect consent for that collection. And when I read that, I said, well, I'm not familiar with that. Let's stop right there, because this is not recommendable. And the reason why this is not recommendable is because in clinical research, the results of the testing and the result of how drug interacts, it may be impacted by race and ethnicity. So because of the habits, because of the genetics of different ethnicities, and so this is relevant data that may be asked for the regulatory authorities by the time they are reviewing the trial documentation, and by the time of approving a drug. So it may happen that an authority, if this data is not in the database of the study, because the patient said, I don't want this to be collected, they were provided with an option to say no. This is data that will lack in the database of that pharma company and may delay the approval of that drug, because the authority will then require that data to be collected and a new study to be conducted. So I said, this is not right. And, let me read the regulatory authority guidance. And when I read it, they were not asking for consent. They were asking for a reason, a justifiable reason to collect that data. And if there was no justifiable reason, then the individuals could have to say no. But of course there was a justifiable reason, because this is so relevant data. And it's, if it's an interventional study, it will be different if it's an observational, for example. Or if so, this is important, and this could be something a data protection lawyer would not spot, because they could not have, they might not have the entire overview of what would be the ultimate goal of a clinical trial, which is to have a drug approved to be um, sold in the market. So this is an example of why it's so important to have people that really understand and navigate clinical trials, and understand, the goals of a pharma company, and not only have experience in data protection law.
Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing
Thank
your insights on AI in pharmaceuticals and technologies and helping us understand the critical regulatory aspects in the industry that many pharma institutions misinterpret.
thank you very much.
To our Pharmatica community, thank you for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, please follow, rate, and share. Join the conversation on X and LinkedIn at pharmatica.io. And visit our website for further information and expert insights, pharmatica.io. Thank you.